To the first lesson of Unit 10 on completing the square, and today we're going to learn one final method of how to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square when the coefficient of a is 1. So far, we have 5 different ways to solve a quadratic equation. Okay, the first way that we learned how is by factoring. So if you factored something and set it equal to 0, like x minus 3, x plus 1 equals 0, then that means either x plus 3 is 0 or x plus 1 is 0. That was our first way of solving. The second way of solving is by taking a square root, which means if I had x squared equals 4, if I took the square root of both sides, x equals 2 or x equals negative 2. The third way we focused on in the last unit is using the quadratic formula, which means I need to take negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, where a, b, and c were the coefficients of my quadratic equation set equal to 0. Finally, we had solving by graphing, which means you just looked on the graph and saw where the graph touched the x-axis, which would be at -1 or +1. So the last method we're going to talk about today is completing the square. Okay, that is the final method. And I hope that you're taking notes because this is going to take you a little bit of time to get used to. And so I want you to make sure that you're taking notes during this lesson in particular. So I hope you have your blue note packet out. If you don't have your blue note packet, then take out a notebook sheet of paper. There's no way you can just watch this video without actually doing something. So make sure you have something to take notes with. All right, do you have something to take notes with? If not, pause the video and get something. There are 5 steps to completing the square. The first thing you're going to do is move c to one side by itself. The second thing you're going to do is make sure that the leading coefficient is 1. The third step kind of has both of these together, so maybe it should be 6 steps, but you're going to take the coefficient of b, divide it by 2, and then square it and add that value to both sides of the equation. Write one side as a perfect square and square root both sides and solve. Let's go ahead and figure out what that term has to be to make a perfect square trinomial. So what that means, I want to know what I need to put in the c value here to make it factor to be something squared. So in this case, I have x squared plus 14x, and I want it to be, what does c have to be? Well, the trick to this is to find what has to be c. We're going back to step 3 here. The coefficient of b divided by 2, and then square it. So on this one, what's our b value? Well, b is 14. What's b divided by 2? That's 7. What's b divided by 2 squared? Well, that's 7 squared. Well, that's 49. So 49 has to be the value that I have to add into this spot. And the reason why I add 49 is now it factors really nicely into 2 different things. X plus 7, x plus 7. This is a perfect square trinomial. All right? So that means that I have now made x plus 7 squared by adding it to that value. Let's look at this one. What do I need to add to c to make this something squared? Well, what is b? b is -2. b over 2 would be -1. So that means I divide this by 2. And of course, b divided by 2 squared would be -1 squared, which is just 1. So I'm going to add 1 to this. And then what would that be factored? Well, it would be x minus 1, x minus 1. -1, -1 make -2. -1 times -1 is +1. So now I made x minus 1 squared. Try to see if you can do the next one without my help. This one's harder, but it's the same process. What's our b value? b equals 7. Take that number, divide it by 2. 7 halves, or 3.5. A lot of us prefer decimals, so 3.5. Then you have b over 2 squared, which is going to be 7 halves squared, or 3.5 squared, which is going to be 49 over 4, which ends up being, I believe it's going to be 12.25, if I'm not mistaken. So I need to add 12.25 to this equation. Or in other words, I'd have x squared plus 7x plus 49 over 4. And then what does this factor into? Well, of course, this one's way harder to factor. I've never factored anything like this, but I made a perfect square trinomial, which means that whatever my b over 2 value was, that's going to go in my factor here. So it's going to be plus 7 over 2. And over here, it's going to be x plus 7 over 2 again. Now watch how this works out. If I FOIL that together, if I multiply it, get rid of this revealer thing here. There we go. If I FOIL this here by doing first times first, I get x squared. Then I do outer, which is going to be 7 over 2x. Then if I do the inner, again another 7 over 2x, or half of 7. And then I do the last term, 7 times half times 7 halves is 49 over 4. And look, I have exactly what I had before. 7 halves and 7 halves makes 7 plus 49 over 4. Okay, so I made a perfect square trinomial. What about the very, very last one over here? What do I have to add for the c value to make this a perfect square? Well, look at b. What's half of b? Half of b is negative 8. Half of that b squared, that's negative 8 squared, equals 64. So I have to add 64 to both sides here. And now it's going to factor perfectly into whatever half of that b value was. X minus 8, x minus 8. And it should work out perfectly then into x minus 8 squared multiplied by itself. Okay? Let's try to solve a quadratic equation using this method. So, first step. Remember the first step? Move c. First step is to move c. How do I move c on this equation? Well, what is c? A is 1, b is 10, c is negative 24. I have to move c, so I'm going to add, or do the opposite of subtract, that 24 to both sides. And now I have x squared plus 10x equals 24. And you notice I left a big old blank spot for the c, because now what I have to do, after I make sure the coefficient of a is 1, is I need to take this b value. What is the b value? So I'm going to write this down, make a 1, and it already is equal to 1, so now I'm going to do step 3. I take b over 2 squared to both sides. So b in this case is 10, b over 2 is 5. If I square that, b over 2 squared equals 25. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. Plus 25, plus 25. And so now I have x squared plus 10x plus the 25 equals 24 plus the extra 25 I added to that side. What is that? 24 plus 25 is 49. Now this thing, step 4, is I need to factor the left side. Okay, so I'm going to factor this thing on the left side of the equation. And it factors really nicely. It's a special case. X and x and positive 5 and positive 5. In other words, it ends up being x plus 5 squared equals 49. How do I get rid of the squared now? This is step 5. Square root and solve. Take the square root of both sides. I'm going to do that now. Square root. I get, in this side on the left, I'm going to get x plus 5. Because that undoes that exponent. The square root of something squared is just x plus 5. What's the square root of 49? It's either positive or negative 7. I don't know which one it's going to be. So that means if I want to solve for x, my last step then is to subtract 5 from both sides. Now I have x equals negative 5 plus 7 or minus 7. Well, what's negative 5 plus 7? Negative 5 plus 7 is 2. So x equals 2, or negative 5 minus 7 is negative 12. Those are my two answers. All right, let's go up here and do another example. What's our first step? The first step is to move the c. Subtract 2 from both sides. Now I have x squared minus 8x equals negative 2. Leave a spot for that c value. Make sure that this a value is 1, and then proceed to step 3, which is to take the b value, which is negative 8, divided by 2, negative 4, and then take that and square it. 16. I'm going to add that to both sides. Plus 16, plus 16. So now I have x squared minus 8x plus 16. On the right side, I have negative 2 plus 16. Well, of course, I can factor the left side now into x minus 4 squared equals 14. Now I have to take the square root of both sides and solve for x. So now I have x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 14. I'm going to add 4 to both sides now, and I'm left with my answer almost of 4 plus or minus the square root of 14. Now in order to get the actual answers, I have to do two calculations. X is either 4 plus the square root of 14, or x is equal to 4 minus the square root of 14. Now I have to use a calculator to help me out with that. So 4 plus the square root of 14, so square root of 14, oops, maybe I have to do that first. Square root of 14 plus 4. So my first answer is 7.74, or, let's do that again, 14 square root times negative 1. Oops, I'm sorry. This calculator is not the one I normally use. We'll make it negative here, then add 4. X equals 0.26. So this is essentially the quadratic formula in a different way. Let's do another one. Again, follow along. First step, number 1, move C. Okay? Now C is already moved. There's no C on the side. That's great. So C is already moved. Step 2 is to make sure that the A value is equal to 1. Is the number by the quadratic term equal to 1? It is. So 2. A equal 1? It does. Great. Then step 3, we need B over 2 squared to both sides. And now B in this case is 2. 2 divided by 1, or sorry, 2 divided by 2 is 1. And I have to square that. What's 1 squared? It's 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. So in this case, I have x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 35 plus 1 is 36. Now I factor the left side. That's step 4 is to factor. So then I get x plus 1 squared equals 36. Step 5 is to take the square root and solve. So now take the square root of both sides, square root of both sides. X plus 1 equals plus or minus 6. So now I have x equals 1, negative 1 minus or plus 6, or x equals negative 1 minus 6. So my x values are going to be what and what? You should have said 5 or negative 7. Okay, time for one more maybe. So let's go ahead and follow the steps. Move C over. Plus 4, plus 4. Left with x squared minus x equals 4. Take B, divide it by 2. Well, that's 1 over 2. Then square it. 1/2 times 1/2. Square the top, square the bottom. It's 1/4. So I'm going to add 1/4 to both sides. 1/4. So now I have x squared minus x plus 1/4 equals, and this is going to be 4, which is going to be 16 over 4, plus the 1/4, which means I have 17 over 4. All right, now what I need to do is I need to factor the left side. And this one's harder to factor because it's harder because there's a fraction. But the trick is whatever this number was, your b over 2, that's what goes inside the parentheses. So it's going to be x minus 1/2. Okay, minus 1/2. I forgot that this would be a negative 1/2 times negative 1/2. So minus 1/2 squared equals 17 over 4. Take the square to both sides and solve. So that means I have x minus 1/2 equals the square root, positive or negative 17/4. Use your calculator to solve the rest of this. We'll do more examples in class. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.